Good evening. The headlines tonight, the 10th of June 1944. Allied forces have linked up across the battlefront in Normandy. They now form a solid front more than 50 miles wide and up to 10 miles deep. Enemy counterattacks are all being resisted. Our planes are now operating from landing strips in France. Our correspondent Richard Dimbleby has flown over the battlefront.
In front of the great mass of shipping, there's the great pattern of France, cratered and re-cratered where our bombs have fallen in the past.
The wounded are returning from Normandy with their stories of the battle. And work has begun on building a new airport for London. It's at a village called Heathrow. 5 days on from D-Day, and stage 1 of the Allied operation is complete. A 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, a lodgement area as it's known, has been occupied. The area runs from the north of Caen, where strong German tank forces are still resisting the British and Canadians, across to Bayeux and the newly captured town of Isigny, where the American forces have now linked up with one another, and then westwards into the Cherbourg Peninsula, where German resistance is said to be beginning to break. American forces are believed to be within 18 miles of Cherbourg itself. But the greatest battle is the one for Caen, where British heavy armour is facing Hitler's elite panzer divisions.
As these pictures show, Rommel's plan to push the Allies back into the sea has failed. But at this stage, the meeting of British and American troops is symbolic rather than strategic. The bitterest fighting is away from the beachheads, and there is much more to come. These tanks, virtually trapped in lanes hemmed in by 12-foot banks and 3-foot hedges, indicate that the battle is not going as planned. In this terrain, German ambushes are easy to mount and effective. A lead tank knocked out holds up the whole column. Even in the best cases, the line of sight is limited to 400 yards. Mortar attack is particularly devastating. And because of the close fighting in this so-called Bocage territory, casualties are high. Ammunition, in particular grenades, are being used at an unexpectedly fast rate. Consequently, the advance has so far not matched the original forecast. Although some columns of German armour have been knocked out by Allied planes, the newly arrived elite Panzer division is providing formidable opposition. They are now defending the small towns around Tilly-sur-Seine, southwest of Caen. The British 50th Division is trying to penetrate the Panzer. All morning long-range bombardment by Royal Navy battleships and cruisers has helped the 50th Division to take some of the small villages around Tilly, although Tilly itself remains in German hands. General Montgomery's plan was to secure the beachheads, force the Germans into a tactical withdrawal, and then break out on both flanks. The Germans are not performing to Monty's script. As we approach the end of the first week of this invasion, there is a sense that the Allied commanders may have chosen Normandy for its favourable landing sites, not for its battlefields.
Allied planes are now operating from airfields inside France, and fighters and fighter bombers have been out again attacking the German supply lines. In the last 5 days, more than 30,000 sorties have been flown.
Since the initial landings, a high Allied priority has been to create makeshift airstrips that would greatly extend the range of the fighter bombers. As of today, the RAF is again operational from French soil. So are Mustangs from the 9th US Air Force. Ground crews were arming Typhoons of the RAF's flying artillery for rocket strafing, in which they've been excelling all week. Together with the Americans, they've flown tens of thousands of sorties, blasting rail yards, wrecking trains, and crippling rail links the Germans are desperately trying to use to bring up panzer reinforcements from the south and the east. Only hours ago, Typhoons of 83 Group attacked the headquarters of German Panzer Group West, reportedly killing several senior officers. And all week, the so-called cab-rank rocket brigade have turned much of northern France into a shooting area, blitzing German airfields, road convoys, bridges, fuel dumps, tank columns, and even here, a command staff car. But the Luftwaffe has at last been putting in an appearance. It seems that during the first days of the invasion, German fighters have been deployed to defend the fatherland against Allied air raids, Those Luftwaffe planes that took off today were soon pounced on by RAF interceptors and shot down. In all, the Luftwaffe has lost 200 planes this week. Allied air superiority over the battlefield has rarely been more supreme.
Wounded Allied troops have been arriving back at south coast ports. It's impossible to estimate the number of casualties during the first 5 days of the invasion, but it's probable that more than 10,000 British, Canadian and American troops have been killed, wounded or are missing.
As the German response has hardened, Allied casualties are mounting, but so too is the operation to treat and evacuate them as speedily as possible. On the beaches, rail tracks carry the victims of the seaborne invasion back to the water's edge. Here, landing ships fitted out as floating hospitals wait to take them to safety. Once across the channel, the wounded are disembarked. Some with minor injuries are disappointed to be out of action. Others say they're lucky to be alive. The numbers of casualties have not been released, but military sources say they had feared a greater attrition rate. As airfields are being opened in France, special hospital planes are being used to ferry some of the most seriously wounded from the advanced battle areas. Fast treatment and evacuation out of the danger zone are essential to maintain the momentum of the Allied advance. Now, 5 days into the invasion, the beachheads are secure enough to enable the first Allied field hospital to be established. American troops have borne the brunt of the casualties, and nurses and doctors are working around the clock to alleviate their suffering. Wounded British soldiers are evacuated home as soon as possible and dispersed to hospitals all over the country by train. The authorities say next of kin of men on the danger list will be notified by telegram, and travel warrants will be provided. In many southern towns, local people have offered to billet relatives overnight so they can visit their injured menfolk.
The West End of London, full of servicemen and women for the past few months, is unusually quiet now. There are few men in uniform to be seen. They're either already over in Normandy or on their way there.
Piccadilly Circus looks almost its old self again. Eros is still boarded up for protection, but since D-Day, there seem to be fewer uniforms about. Queues for the cinema and theatre are shorter, and it's rumoured that you can even find a taxi without a GI inside. They're all in Normandy. There's a Russian theme for this season's opening night, to mark the opening of the 50th season of Promenade Concerts. Earlier this week, Sir Henry Wood, the founder of the Proms, was made a Companion of Honour by the King, and Sir Henry has no intention of retiring.
And although we celebrate this anniversary in the year of my Promenade Concerts Jubilee, I assure you I do not contemplate retirement.
With the opening of the second front, British films are taking the offensive too. The Way Ahead opens tonight at the Odeon in Leicester Square. The Way Ahead stars David Niven and Stanley Holloway. It tells the story of a typical platoon of soldiers. With humour and realism, it follows them from raw recruits to battle-hardened veterans.
Look!
The script is co-written by a young recruit with a Russian name, Peter Ustinov, and based in part on his own British Army experiences.
Too stupid for words.
Work is beginning this weekend on London's new airport. There's been a mystery over its exact location since Brigadier General Critchley, the Director General of British Overseas Airways Corporation, said last March that it would be within 12.5 miles of Hyde Park. Well, now the secret is out. Today, scores of lorries and bulldozers assembled at the village of Heathrow near Hayes. Roads were closed and nearby farmers are being given a month's notice to vacate their property. Archaeologists are rushing to Caesar's Camp, a Celtic settlement which they say is one of the most ancient sites in Britain. They're arranging a hasty dig for remains before it's covered with concrete. According to one estimate, the main runway will be 5 miles long and more than 2 million square yards of concrete will be laid for runways and taxiways. It will be, say officials, the finest and best equipped airport in the post-war world. Sport, and at Lord's, a crowd of more than 10,000 saw the England 11 under Wally Hammond beat Leary Constantine's West Indies side by 166 runs. The West Indies were bowled out for 77. It's Ascot again, and today saw a full day's racing with the jockey Gordon Richards riding 4 winners in succession: Red Fife, Neola, Milling and Isle of Capri. It's increased speculation about which horse he will ride in the Derby in a week's time, one of the few major races the champion jockey has never won. And finally, back to D-Day. Ever since the day dawned 5 days ago, people have been wondering what the D stands for. Letters to the newspapers have made various suggestions. For example, the D stands for deliverance. But Supreme Allied Headquarters says that the D stands simply for day. And on this D-Day +4, we have a dispatch from the BBC's Richard Dimbleby. Today, he flew to France in an RAF Mosquito. Here's his description of the scene below.
Hello, BBC. This is Richard Dimbleby calling you from over the English Channel, flying between England and France. This must be the first time that anyone like me has been able to call you from a formation of fighters, single-engined aircraft which can't take a passenger. The only reason that I'm here is because I'm traveling in a Mosquito which can carry a second person, and we have tacked ourselves onto the back of the fighter formation. For years, I've been used to describing things, but I find it difficult to tell you just how this looks. In front of the great mass of shipping, there's the great pattern of France, cratered and re-cratered where our bombs have fallen in the past. Here is the new landing strip, lying out looking for all the world like an old established and magnificently prepared aerodrome. We're diving down and coming in over it right now, flying straight over the top. And there, in the distance, and all round us, in a great semicircle, is the battlefront. I can see the whole of it from east to west.
And with that description from Richard Dimbleby watching the Allied forces in the fields of Normandy, we end our coverage of the news of D-Day week 1944. That was the news 50 years ago. In fact, the war was far from over. Only 3 days later, Hitler retaliated by releasing his secret weapon, the V-1 flying bomb, nicknamed the Doodlebug. More than 100 of them were dropped on Britain over the next few weeks. It took 50 days for the British Army to advance beyond Caen to a stage they should have reached on D-Day +5. It took 75 days of fighting before the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and moved towards Paris. During this period, the military casualties were huge. 400,000 men were killed or wounded. 170,000 of them were Allied troops. Nevertheless, by Christmas, the Allies were on the German border, and by March, they were over the Rhine and into Germany. The war ended 2 months later, on D-Day +336.
And as seen through the eyes of BBC reporters 50 years ago, the crucial events of World War II, from D-Day to VE Day, are chronicled in this BBC book.